Growing up in Texas, we're taught to have this deep sense of pride in the size of our state. It manifests itself in so many aspects of life in Texas, hence the phrase, everything's bigger in Texas. And one thing I remember hearing a few times growing up in Houston is Texas is so big that you have to fly between Houston and El Paso, as opposed to driving, which you would presumably do to get between any two cities in any other state. And sure enough, in 2020, when our state tournament for debate was in El Paso, we all flew instead of driving. But this always fascinated me because I assumed that it was very rare to have a flight route between two places in the same state. So I got curious and compiled a list of every single one, and spoiler alert, it's actually not that rare. Right now, exactly half of the states have at least one. There's around 498 of these intrastate flights in the US, but nearly half of them are in one state, which is Alaska. I managed to count 232, and that's why I used the word around before. Because with that many, the odds that I missed at least one are fairly high. Alaska alone took me like 3 hours. I knew that there were a lot of flights between smaller towns, but I didn't expect them to show up on Google Flights. So I started out with all the flights between Anchorage and other cities in Alaska, and there's 16 of those. And then I went to all the routes out of Fairbanks, and then it got really fucking hard. I was learning about airlines and towns I'd never even heard of. There's actually an airline called Ryanair, with a space between Ryan and Air, not to be confused with the European airline. I decided that seaplanes don't count because if I hadn't drawn the line somewhere, this list probably would have gone past 500 or 600. Once you get out in the unorganized borough or the Aleutian Islands, there's not really any hubs. Like, there's just random combinations of towns, which is why I think I probably missed one somewhere. Despite the anecdote I talked about at the beginning of the video being from Texas, we don't even come in second place. That would be California, which has 62 of these routes. Unsurprisingly, most of these are LAX, San Diego, and San Francisco. But there's also a fair amount from Palm Springs, Burbank, and Ontario. Don't quote me on this, but I bet California from north to south is about as far as Texas from east to west. So it's not very surprising that there's this many, and it'll probably stay that way because they're never gonna finish that high-speed rail thing they've been working on my whole life. Texas does finish right behind them with 57 routes. There's a lot of crossover here though, because Houston and Dallas both have 2 airports. There's not many budget airline routes to or from Texas. Budget airlines tend to fly to smaller airports or they fly routes with no competition, but Texas doesn't really have many of those routes. So unlike California, which has a few one-off routes that were pretty difficult to find, Texas has none. All of the flights on this list originate from either of Houston's airports, either of Dallas's airports, San Antonio or Austin. It really drops off after that. In 4th place, Florida has 21, at least at the time of when I did all of this research like 8 months ago, because they have discontinued Palm Beach to Tampa, so now it's only 20. Most people outside of Florida don't know that they basically have their own airline, which they operate a fleet of very small planes, so there's not much capacity as compared to the major carriers, but it's called Silver Airways. And a couple of these routes, they're the only one that flies them. Unsurprisingly, Hawaii has 16, which these are just basically every combination of the islands. Colorado has 11 routes, and they all originate from Denver. Here's where we start to get into the asterisk, I guess, because states like Texas and California are genuinely big enough to where you need to fly sometimes between 2 destinations in the same state. But with a lot of these states, the purpose of these flights is not that, but rather so that you can connect at the state's major hub airport. I can't imagine that many people are flying from Colorado Springs to Denver, for example. It's like an hour and 15-minute drive. Michigan is a similar story. They have 10 routes and they all originate out of Detroit, but there are a few to the Upper Peninsula which make more sense on their own. Washington State has 9 routes, although they don't all originate from Seattle. 7 of them do, and they just go to basically the 7 other largest cities in Washington. But 2 of them originate from Boeing Field, or officially King County International Airport. And from there, a commuter airline called Kenmore Air flies to 2 islands in the Puget Sound. Massachusetts also has 9, and you would think that this would be because of all the islands they have, which is mostly true, but for some reason there is a flight from Boston to a town that's on the mainland. Only 4 of these routes originate from Boston Logan, while 3 originate from Martha's Vineyard and 2 originate from Nantucket. Almost all of these, though, are not served by the major airlines, but rather Cape Air, which is a hard to describe airline because it sounds like it would be Massachusetts, given the name, and it is headquartered there and has most of its operations there, but we'll get to that later. It also has a surprising presence in other parts of the country. Another state with 9 is New York, and there's not much to talk about here because they're just all connecting flights to JFK or LaGuardia. Illinois has 8 routes, and they all originate from O'Hare. North Carolina has 8 routes, and they all originate from Charlotte. very boring. Those are just all connecting flights. Although some of these are incredibly short. This is one of my favorite little niche facts from doing so much of research on Google Flights, is on shorter flights, they just straight up lie about how long they are. They're generally pretty accurate for the longer ones, but once you get down to the shorter ones, they always way overestimate, and I don't know why. Like, you can't tell me Charlotte to Fayetteville is an hour and 20 minutes. This is not just a US thing either. The shortest flight I've ever flown on was from Athens to Santorini, which they say is a 55-minute flight, but it was actually almost half that. Pennsylvania has 7, and interestingly, other than the very obvious Philadelphia-Pittsburgh route, each of those 2 cities has 3 of their own, and they have no overlap. Minnesota also has 7, and they're all connecting flights for MSP. Montana, surprisingly, has 5, and they're all Cape Air for some reason. Literally, Cape Air's biggest presence outside of Massachusetts is in eastern Montana, connecting 5 random towns to the state's largest city, Billings. Virginia has 5, which are presumably all connections. Charlottesville to Dulles is crazy. These 2 places are like 2 hours drive apart. Just short enough to where it seems futile to fly between them, but just long enough to where it also is like too far to drive. Georgia has 5 routes, and they're all connections to Atlanta. Arizona is the exact same thing. They have 5 routes, and they're all connecting in Phoenix. Oregon has 3 routes, and this is pretty satisfying because there's really only 3 other airports in Oregon besides PDX, and you can fly to all 3 of them. And no, Salem Airport does not count. There's like 2 flights a week out of there. New Mexico has 2 routes, and while they both originate out of Albuquerque, it's not just for connections. Instead, they're federally subsidized under what's called the Essential Air Service program. So the government is literally paying airlines to run unprofitable flights. A lot of these flights are pretty empty. There's a few routes on the big airlines that take advantage of this program, but for the most part, it's very small airlines. In this case, Advanced Air, which only operates in the Southwest. Utah has 2 routes, but they're not Essential Air Service. They're both flown by Delta. This one makes some sense because both of these places are in the southwest corner of Utah, which is not a huge state, but it's pretty mountainous, so it can be hard to drive. And now we get to the states with only one. Starting with Nevada, unsurprisingly, with Las Vegas to Reno. Pretty great. It connects like 95% of the state's population. Also unsurprising, Missouri is from St. Louis to Kansas City. This is one that demonstrates what I got a lot of comments about when I made a TikTok about this subject, which is that our train system in the US is just total shit. Because there are trains between these 2 cities, like multiple a day, and yet there's also several flights a day, and people are willing to pay way more. On April 8th, Tennessee will become the 26th state on this list when Southwest starts flying from Memphis to Nashville. This one is really weird. North Dakota actually has one between Jamestown and Devil's Lake. These 2 places are closer together than Charlottesville and Dulles. I was told that the reason this exists is because it's a rare triangular route on United Express. They fly Denver to Devil's Lake to Jamestown, and then Jamestown back to Denver and vice versa. But if they're doing all that, I feel like you could probably cut costs by just not selling tickets on Jamestown to Devil's Lake. I want to take this flight one day. This is like probably the weirdest flight on this list because it's not an Essential Air Service flight, and also I know they're lying about the 50 minutes that it says on Google Flights. And I don't know why you wouldn't just fly from these 2 places directly to Denver, because if you look on Google Flights, the 2 options are always exactly the same. Like, flying direct from Jamestown or Devil's Lake to Denver is always the exact same price as flying from either of those with a stop in the other one. The last route I originally said was the weirdest route in the US, but maybe not so much. It's West Virginia. They have a route from Beckley to Parkersburg. This flight is an Essential Air Service flight though, this time operated by Contour Airlines, so it has a reason to exist, at least financially. There's 2 a day, and they're always $29 no matter what. I almost took this flight on my 22nd birthday, and it's a similar story to the North Dakota one, where it's supposedly to connect in Charlotte, and I had someone tell me that they'll probably look at you like you're crazy if you try to book just the Beckley to Parkersburg route. One of these weekends I gotta go out and do this flight because I really want to see how full it is. There's no way they're filling seats on this. And with that, we're done. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what other type of aviation or travel stuff you would want to see, or politics. Don't forget, I do that too. I have no time or energy to make anything other than this podcast style stuff on here. So if you want more stuff like that, let me know.